Art of Time Ensemble presents Dance to the Abyss at Harborfront Center Theater, February 23rd to the 25th. Step back in time to the 1920s and immerse yourself in the decadent world of the Weimar Republic. Join us for a night of cabaret and jazz-inspired songs as we explore the music that once defined an era on the brink of catastrophe, featuring the work of Jewish composers Erwin Schulhoff, Misha Spolansky, and musicians Wallace Holliday, Kevin Turcotte, Andrew Barashko, Drew Jureka, and more. Tickets on sale now at harborfrontcenter.com. Use promo code CABARET25 to receive 25% off your tickets.
This is Bonjour Chai, the potato latke on a bike edition. I'm Avi Feingold. I'm here with Phoebe Maltzvovi and special guest Emil Scher. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk about banning books. We talk about censoring ideas. We talk about the role of the library in a public space. All this and more coming up. Emil Scher, he is an author in many, many different formats, including children's, young adult, adult fiction, plays, screenplays. He'll tell me if there's any other formats that I have missed out on. He is also the writer-in-residence of the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, a place which, for reasons I will explain very shortly, is very, very near and dear to me. Emil, welcome to Bonjour Chai.
It's a pleasure to be here, Avi and Phoebe. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us.
So what does a writer-in-residence do?
That's a great question. You could be a poet, filmmaker. I mean, artist in residence is an umbrella term that you see more and more often. Traditionally, a writer in residence is given support to both work on a creative work of their own choosing, or to work on a manuscript, and to engage with community. So what I'm doing in terms of the Jewish Public Library, where I grew up, born and raised in Montreal. We did, of course, a talk this week on book banning. In terms of engaging with community and at the same time working on a manuscript, I'm sending out weekly essays, and they're basically
I was going to say these letters to your daughters, which are really beautiful. Yeah.
So the manuscript I'm working on is a form of engaging community, because what I'm doing is I'm sharing on a weekly basis a manuscript that I've been calling Daughters of Abraham. And its roots are, in fact, my daughters went to the same Jewish summer camp where I worked for many, many years, although they're born in Toronto. They were both at McGill, and I thought, how am I going to try to engage them with Jewish learning? And I am, by and large, was raised as a secular Jew in Montreal. And of course, as I get older, I find myself wading deeper and deeper into the waters of Judaism and finding more and more meaning as I dive in. And I knew they would not likely want to unpack a weekly parsha. So I thought, well, what can I do that almost could parallel that experience to a certain degree? I was introduced to the works of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and of course I started reading these Heschel quotes, and they spoke to me. And if you're, I think, a Jewish progressive, I think much of Heschel's writings would resonate with you. And I think it's worth taking a little sidebar and mentioning his daughter, Susanna Heschel, is, for those of you who put an orange on your Seder plate during Passover, she basically initiated that. So I basically sent, as they were undergrads at McGill, via email, a Heschel quote, and I used a book called Essential Writings, which Susanna Heschel edited, of Heschel's varied and a very large body of work, sent a Heschel quote and just riffed on it. Here's my thoughts on this quote. Do with it what you will. No expectation that they would necessarily dive into it on a daily basis, regular basis. I simply wanted to plant that seed. I did that over the course of a Jewish year, so I had 52 emails, if you will. And of course, I thought, the writer in me thought, gee, is there a wider audience for this? Well, and so when I had this opportunity to work as writer in residence at the JPL, I thought this seemed like an opportune moment to work on the manuscript, but even probably more importantly, introduce the JPL community to the works of Abraham Joshua Heschel, and equally, frame it as a literary work. And that's what I will be doing as writer in residence.
Well, that's really cool.
So my connection to the Jewish Public Library is that for 36 years, my father was the reference librarian at the Jewish Public Library. I pretty much grew up there, in and out all the time. I shelved books. I indexed from the card catalog. I was always or helping things, or with the checkout cards. I was filing and organizing, and I was always around. I was part of the library community. And then when I returned to Montreal, I joined the board actually, which I served on until my relocation several months ago. So I have a connection. I no longer have a formal connection, but it will always be deep in my heart. that's going to be necessary for whatever we'll talk about a little bit later. But that the library has always, been a huge part of my life, and there will always be a huge part of my heart and my life for the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. And I'm just glad that you are part of it. So can you tell us, moving more to some of the topical stuff that we're dealing with, you gave this talk about the history of censorship and banning books. Can you tell us a little bit about it without us having been on the Zoom?
It was, I was introduced, again, because of programming. I work with the programming people at the JPL. So in this instance, I thought I'd do one on Hannah Suitcase, which I adapted. You're likely familiar with the Karen Levine book, beautiful book called Hannah Suitcase, and very moving. We can talk about that if the opportunity arises. So I thought I could do a presentation on Hannah Suitcase, but they came and said, no, let's see, what can we do to mark Freedom to Read Week? And that was terrific. And so the initial intent didn't change. I thought I would just do an overview. I'm not an authority on book banning by any means, but I did a bit of research. I'm familiar enough, as we all are, with the books that have been banned. One of them, it's just jaw-dropping. In Florida, I kept circling back to Florida, the things that are happening in Florida, and Moms for Liberty, etc. And there's one of the people who works in the library, one of the programming, the head of programming, Morgan Liebner, is from Florida. So during my talk earlier this week, I kept talking about Florida. I said, Morgan, excuse me if you feel there's a target on your shirt, because so much of this book banning and intolerance springs from Florida. And the latest that I had heard was one county in Florida had banned a dictionary. So I was familiar with the extremes and lengths that people are going to. But I was also drawn to it because, again, if you're in the arts, you're always looking for the subtext, the layer beneath what you actually see on the surface. And so, and also what I think is so central to any type of creative endeavor is the questioning. That I don't think it's enough to stop and say, oh my God, what idiots, what small-minded fools, for banning a dictionary. Because then where does that get you? Like, that's just a one-way, that's a dead end. And I just think it's so important, to the degree that you can, to have a conversation about the very thing that could be discomforting, that you simply get, that can be a challenge to have. So that was part of my take, and looking for the contradictions. So I did a bit of research, and I'd remembered years ago I'd read it was a one-page spread in the New York Times Book Review by a novelist and author named Nora Krug, and she talked about Mein Kampf. And even then I thought, am I going to introduce Mein Kampf at the Jewish Public Library? Where will that lead? But her story was just fascinating. She actually ended up being married into a Jewish family, a lot of history of anti-Semitism with her own life growing up in Germany. And she did this, and she talked about how, I believe it was in 1949 when Mein Kampf was banned in Germany. This is a quote from this lovely graphic novel type spread that she did in the New York Times Book Review. Germany offers only an annotated version of Mein Kampf. The ban was lifted in 2016. Proceeds of Mein Kampf, a critical edition, are donated to an organization that supports victims of the Nazi regime. This part I love. The book's interior layout is inspired by the Talmud. Its 3,500 annotations dissect Adolf Hitler's message. And so what I was drawn to is just wherever there's some type of tension, I think at the heart of all storytelling is some type of tension, dramatic or otherwise. And so to have a German author, who had steeped in, of course, that ethos, if you will, and was familiar with the anti-Semitism within her own family, I'm drawn to that type of tension wherever possible. So the wider arc, yes, it was about book banning, but that inherently speaks to these contradictions that I've just wanted to explore to the degree that I could. And so I did almost an overview, if you will. And I also, wherever possible, I want to also introduce the arts and the role that artists, capital A artists, and art can make in exploring these difficult themes. And so I just want to share one other quote that I think many of your listeners will be familiar with. And I will paraphrase it, as it often is. When you burn books, next you will be burning people. I imagine some of your listeners will be familiar with that. But let me ask you, so what do you think the context is for that quote? It's Heinrich Heine. I may not be pronouncing his name. A German author, I think poet as well. Any idea of where that was first phrased, in other words? What was the context?
I know about him because I wrote about him in my doctoral dissertation. But I don't know specifically where that quote comes from.
One could easily see how that one would think, oh, he said that like in an interview, or he wrote that in an essay. And in fact, it came from a stage play. And so that's what I mean about, you see, you can use the world of fiction and the make-believe to confront some really harsh truths. So I just want to give the context. It was from an 1821 play called Al-Mansur, spoken by the Muslim Hassan upon hearing that Christian conquerors burned the Quran at the marketplace of Granada. And the quote from the play that this character says is, "That was but a prelude. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well." And I never knew that. And I just thought, well, what that does is reinforce, again, just the role of creativity, of capital A art in, as I say, just confronting things that I think are not as easily confronted in everyday speech, if you will.
So can I ask something just about, like, I guess when people talk about book banning or, the stifling of speech, I think it often gets tricky because there are so many different things that could refer to. It could refer, obviously, there's the, government actually bans speech, or artists or writers are actually, subject to violence. There's that level. But then there's also stuff about that becomes more like curatorial choices about what different places showcase, whether they have certain missions, whether they're, whether it's a children's library or, like a library in a school and all of that. And I think like the local bookstore near me in Toronto has literally on its bookmarks social justice, which tells you there are the books that would and wouldn't be sold there. It's not that they're saying ban the ones that aren't sold there, but you know what I'm saying? So like, I guess what I'm wondering about in my rambling way is really just how you define book banning. Like where would you, is it just these extreme cases where the government steps in, or is it, or violent, people in the community step in, or is it something else? Like what should be the line?
I think that's a great question. What comes to mind as I hear you speak, and I really appreciate bringing that very question to the table, is who pulls the levers? So in other words, you're talking about a wide spectrum of how do we define book banning? And to me, that begs the question, who's doing the banning? Because I think that's sort of, it's like, crack that further open. Who is entrusted to make these decisions? And so I don't think there's one particular answer. I think it's worth, I guess what that would lead me to is, what is the process? What are the institutions? How did we institutionalize this process? And what is it reflective of? So, for example, my understanding, and again, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think in several school counties in the States, all it takes is one parent to say, I don't want my child reading this Genderqueer is one of the most banned books or challenged, or Sherman Alexie's. I find it frightening that the one parent can decide, I find this book objectionable, I don't want my child to read it, for that book to be removed from a high school library shelf. That's my understanding. That's how it could happen. So I think you're getting into language as well, and I appreciate that, because I react the same way. The weight of language. What does it mean to ban a book? Does it mean it's completely removed? Does it mean it's burned? There's absolutely, book banning and book burning are close cousins. So I would say, if I had to give in direct response to your question, I would define it as denying one individual, if you will, and actually one individual or institution, and let's understand institution to be a government, denying another individual the right to read a particular story, narrative, manuscript, poem, whatever you choose.
And do you think there's an age cap? I guess that's the other aspect of it, because I'm just thinking about how in the States it's always done in this sort of think of the children angle, or not always, but very often it's about, what do people want children to be exposed to? And I think my own take on this is very different if you're talking about, 5-year-olds and if you're talking about high school students. And given what high school students are already seeing on the internet, it seems like the idea that a high school library is going to ban something just seems a little interesting way of thinking about it. But I don't know. How do you see it as a children's book author yourself?
No, I agree. And I think there is some consideration that has to be given to younger children in terms of age appropriate, and not necessarily that you using the proper language. Same thing with sexuality, right? You would certainly use language with a group of 15-year-olds that would be inappropriate for a group of 5-year-olds in terms of introducing them to that. So I think there can be a distinction. And he also raised a good point, which I mentioned this past week, or I believe I mentioned it, that conversations about banned books, particularly with high schools. By the way, most of the literature I've read when it comes to banning books in the current climate is high schools or elementary. It's the school setting. You rarely hear about it in the university setting, bookstores, et cetera, et cetera. And so where the conversation has so changed that in 2024, one thing that has not changed, and Sherman Alexie spoke about this, is that, of course, nothing sells a book more than banning a book, right? I mean, that's right away. If you want to whet an appetite, ban the book. But particularly with these teenagers today, I mean, I actually thought about it. Not only could they order it, let's say on Amazon, And they think, oh my God, well, what if it comes in a brown package back? It doesn't even have to come to your home. There's these Penguin pickups. You can have it delivered to someone else. So you can literally have the banned book in your hands the next day.
Or an ebook.
Or an ebook. So I'm not even sure. And that's why it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the conversation. If you have the mother who wants to ban the book genderqueer, or doesn't want her child reading genderqueer, and you can say, well, you know what? We can ban it. We can take it off the bookshelf. We can have a massive bonfire in front of the high school and burn all these books that you're opposed to. Your child could have this book in their hands, or as Phoebe said, on their screen an hour later.
Don't take half measures when it comes to home security. Alarms and cameras work, but they'll only tell you that your worst nightmare just came true. Safety Screen by Metalex for windows and doors will keep your family safe and sound with real stopping power. They can't be cut, pried, or bashed in, so you can enjoy carefree ventilation in the spring and fall with peace of mind. And protect your fixed windows and doors with rock glass, an absolutely unbreakable clear covering. Call 416-638-2539 or visit metalexsecurity.com to book your free consultation. That's METALEX security.com. Remember, prevention is always better than the cure.
The more immediate discussion that we, want to talk about today is that for years, my father, who, as you know, as I mentioned, was the librarian at the library, I always used to give an example of Mein Kampf, right? And I was a kid. I was like, well, the library can't possibly have Mein Kampf, right? That's a horrible book to have. And I was a kid. He goes, no, we have it. We never ban books. We never take books away. We just know that if we kept it on the shelves, people are going to steal it. People are going to deface it. So we keep it behind the shelves, where we call not in the closed stacks, but it's available for anybody to borrow. If you want to read it, you don't even have to come up with a valid reason, right? If you want to read it, we will lend it to you. You can read it, and then you give it back, and that's that. This is what happened, and people aren't always aware of the context of banning a book versus putting it in closed stacks for a variety of reasons. This is what happened, I believe, with Elise Gravel's book, which caused a firestorm.
Yes. So can we just, as somebody who had only learned from you, Avi, about the existence of a Jewish public library in Montreal, basically, what is the library in terms of its mission and the ages served? Like, is there what is the significance of I need the context for this, because
if I can summarize everything, the Jewish Public Library has been around for over 100 years as both a public community library as well as a research library in Jewish Canadian studies and Jewish studies in general. It is its Jewish collection rivals many major universities' Jewish collections. So that means that many students from the Montreal universities would come to Montreal, to the Jewish Public Library, if they were researching Jewish studies. And the Jewish archives at the library are also world class, and people will come and study it. So it is both a research place and a community library. So in that sense, it has a children's library, it has an adult library, it has a lending library, all of that stuff. The way I understand what happened is that Elise Gravel, who is an award-winning Quebec author, who publishes children's books primarily, if I don't believe exclusively, came under fire because she was very vocal on social media, especially Instagram, because of her little drawn cartoon characters, expressing very, very vocal and very repeated support for the Palestinian cause, repeating many tropes which were not just bordering on anti-Semitic, but were virulently anti-Semitic, untruthful in a lot of cases, and deeply problematic. The library, the way I understand it, the library was pressured by many Jewish communal organizations to remove her books from the stacks, either to remove them completely or to put them in the closed stacks. They bowed from the pressure and they put them in the closed stacks, meaning that their books were available to borrow, but they weren't available in public. This is despite many other libraries saying that her opinions are objectionable, but we are not going to take her books away. The Côte Saint Luc Library did not, which is basically as Jewish a library as it gets, because it's pretty, it's 90% Jewish or whatever it's going to be, but it's not officially a Jewish library. Many other librarians expressed support for keeping the books there, even while disapproving of her opinions or approving of her opinions, whatever it might be. And
well, there's a big difference between allowing,
regardless of that spread, everybody was saying the books should stay there. And under pressure from Jewish communal organizations, the library put them in their closed stacks, but then after much public pressure, including public protests by IJV, Independent Jewish Voices, in front of the library, as well as a lot of online discussion, the library went and returned her books to the public open stacks.
Well, and as Avid mentioned, and this is an argument we can expect that, but still worth restating, is separating the art from the artist. So and I actually asked a friend, Jewish friend, teacher, now living in Toronto, but born and raised in Montreal, 2 daughters, 3 children, adult children, 2 live in Israel. And I asked specifically about Elise Gravel, like, would you have Elise Gravel books in your house? And she said yes. And she actually mentioned Roald Dahl. And I spoke at length about Roald Dahl at my talk this week at the JPL, because certainly you're talking about a much larger landscape, if you will, global. And some of the things he said overtly, and I'll just share a couple. There's a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. I am certainly anti-Israel, and I've become anti-Semitic. And he makes reference to the powerful American Jewish bankers. So we're getting a sense of who he is.
It's not just him. I mean, it's T.S. Eliot was also virulently anti-Semitic. Wagner was anti-Semitic.
So then but then Spielberg, creator of Schindler's List, filmed an adaptation of a Roald Dahl book called BFG, Big Friendly Giant. And he talked about the paradox. And that's what I think, again, I'm much more drawn to that paradox and that conflict. And I think if you have a child, we talk about age appropriate. I think there is value in teaching a 5 or 6-year-old who maybe has an Elise Gravel picture book, who has more Roald Dahl book. I mean, James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, all this, Willy Wonka. And to explain that somebody who really says hurtful things, thinks hurtful thoughts, can still create a beautiful picture book. And to be able to hold that tension, even within, as a 5-year-old can, in their own 5-year-old way, equally the 55-year-old can as well. What I will say is that, and I arrived, so my residency began this month, and it sort of coincided with the arrival of a new executive director, Alain Danziger. And again, it's probably worth noting, he came from the Grand Ballet Canadien, so again, the world of ballet. And so even that provides some context. And I mention him because, again, I can't speak to previous administrations. It wouldn't be fair or, to anyone involved. But the phrase that Alain has mentioned more than once is critical thinking. And that's a phrase that I embrace. Again, that's another phrase you can unpack and define in many ways. But I interpret critical thinking, to answer your question, Zach, is that, in fact, is to give everything the due consideration it deserves. And when I say everything, it could be material that's objectionable. It doesn't mean there aren't instances like, I'm not sure you could sell a book on 10 Easy Steps to Lynching a Black Person, chapter 1. I mean, it just would not, I don't imagine that would pass muster. So I don't want you, so the idea of critical thinking, I think, is such a crucial and essential lens upon which to consider all the material, all the books.
Well, can I just ask something about this, which is just, so I should say, like, my prior here is I say the book should be on the shelf. I'm not, I'm not against that. I think she is not somebody I'd probably get along with well. But the point is, I guess what I'm wondering about is whether you see a difference between someone who's deceased and somebody who is a sort of earlier career, making their name. Because I think that might be like some of what's going on here, is that there's a sense of that you're not just endorsing separating art from artist, I think, is a lot easier when you're talking either about somebody who's no longer living or somebody whose reputation is just so long since established. So you have people who, don't like Woody Allen, but will watch a Woody Allen movie and it just we're all these but dots compared to Woody Allen in the world. You know what I mean? But I feel like if you're talking about somebody who's still making their name, are the stakes different?
I would say I would almost invite that. Like, the dead person has come and gone again, because then it's more active, it's more in the moment, and I would actually invite a living author whose works are whose pronouncements are objectionable, whose perspective, who it could be anti-Semitic, could be racist, a virulent misogynist, all that, I would say, it just makes the discussion more lively and immediate. And so I would actually I wouldn't say prefer, but I would not negate it in any way. Because one can even say, well, wait, the jury's not in yet. This person's only 30 and written 2 books. Let's wait until they're 60 and written 10. I don't think we have to wait, because I think the same dynamic is there and is worthy of exploring and confronting.
We keep talking about the Jewish Public Library, and Avi compared it to the Municipal Côte St. Luc Library. But
I made a distinction that is a community library. The Jewish Public Library has dual functions as both a research library and a public library.
Well, but it's not. The thing that I want to ask is it public? Or is it a private institution? Because if it's a private institution, there's a part of me that thinks like a bookstore. I don't think a private bookstore should have to carry books they don't want to carry. And if you're a Catholic library, you can have a collection that leans into your values. It's different when it's a public government funded by all the taxpayers type of thing. So I was curious, do you see that as a distinction that is worth thinking about here?
I can't say with certainty, but it is a public library in terms of it's a nonprofit. And so I think that in and of itself, it's accountable to a board, of course, but as opposed to a private institution, I think you raised that there's an important distinction between the two. So it's by no means, I think, could be considered a private institution. But because it's a public institution, if your mandate is one that is geared towards the public, all the more reason to consider the very material that a private institution wouldn't consider and would just fold their arms and say, too bad, we run the show here. So I think in some ways the responsibility is even greater. And again, the decisions require a lot of weight.
Look, I have made no bones publicly, although I'm not on too much on social media. I've spoken to people about this, and I'll say this on the show. I think the library made the wrong decision by initially pulling the books from the public stacks.
I totally agree, and I agree. It was a mistake.
I think it was a big mistake. I think it was pressure from members of the Jewish community and Jewish communal organizations that are really looking very small-minded way. They did not ask for T.S. Eliot's books to be pulled. They did not ask for Roald Dahl's books to be pulled. What I think was a missed opportunity, and in the days since has really shown itself, is that Elise Ravel is the type of person that's willing to have dialogue, is willing to be able to say, my books have nothing to do with this.
She also has on her Instagram, I'm blocking all Zionists who have, I'm blocking all right-wing Zionists or something.
I am fine with somebody saying that and saying that I am mistaken. I saw that yesterday on Instagram, she posted, let us support Jews who support certain opinions. And she's saying, look, I care about Jews. I'm not saying that I think Jews are evil. I've figured out that this is a mistaken approach. I am going to, be better about this. And I'm going to say that this is what's going on. I think that we missed an opportunity for example, the writer in residence of the Jewish Public Library to engage in a dialogue publicly with the writer, with a famous writer who can go and say, I have a principled stance that I'm trying to take, and I want to be able to discuss these things. I know that happened in private, for example, with Sija, that she did meeting with them. But, this public airing of ideas, I think that to me is the real book burning that happens and book banning that happens in today's day and age is, as we've said, it's not about books being banned. It's about ideas being banned. It's about saying that this idea is wrong.
Avi, at a Jewish high school, would gender queer be on the shelves in the
So at
library?
a Jewish high school, so first of all, I may disagree with this. I grew up in a very, very religious Jewish high school in Montreal. And, there would be stuff like the Guinness Book of Records, because it was so popular, was on the shelves, but they would add in with like magic marker, like skirts and long sleeves onto the gymnasts or something like that. Right, and then they would deliberately not have certain books.
So free speech for thee, but not for me, or some such.
No, they don't.
I think it's just interesting. No, but
they don't believe, and I don't believe that that's the right approach.
Okay.
I think that I want to be able to tell my children everything and help them make decisions about whatever ideas are fine or not. I'm not going to pass judgment on a private school and how good or bad it is. I may disagree with it personally, but I see where they're coming from. That they want to have a certain approach, and Christian schools do this also. I disagree with it, but it's there. This is a very, very different thing that's going on here, which is basically saying in public institutions, we want to ban certain ideas from happening.
Right. I think we're talking about public high schools, though, that is still children, and then it's still like it's a little more overlapping. But what I wanted to talk about, though, it's not exactly devil's advocate, but it's more just like taking a step back. So fine and well, and I am doing it too, to talk about the abstract principles of free speech and the value of exchange of ideas and all of this. But it's also at the same time necessary to keep in mind the literary community in general and where Jews sit within it. And I'm thinking about something specifically, which was this, the Jewish Book Council on February 14th, so Valentine's Day, had its little Valentine to the world is something called Reporting Anti-Semitism in the Literary World. And it gives you an email address that you can send. It says, if you have experienced or witnessed an anti-Semitic incident in literary spaces that you'd like to report, please email, and they give you their email address for this with information and a description of what occurred. If you have photos, links, transcripts, communications, video, or screenshots, whatever. So it's interesting because, so the reason this came on my radar is that people were posting just in forums I'm in about things like some poetry journal saying like no Zionists should send anything in or some things like that. And I think there's something happening. It's not just about Jews, it's not just about Israel, and it's not just post-October 7th, but where you have on the one hand this right-wing push to ban so-called woke books, right? But you also have a publishing industry that's pretty monolithic in its own ideology.
That's what I just said. It's just that both sides are engaging in the same issue. Let me finish. So I guess what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about things like my local bookstore and how like the children's books are all a very, very specific type of politics. And that's not just this one bookstore. That's like just bookstores generally in downtown Toronto, and I would assume in equivalent places throughout North America. The publishing industry has its own kind of like stance, right? And I think some of why somebody like Elise Gravel might be pushing buttons isn't that she's this like sort of renegade free thinker saying what nobody dares say, but rather what she represents is a mainstream position within literary community. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So I'm saying I think some of what people are reacting to, and I say this as somebody who thinks she should be on the shelf, who also doesn't particularly want to go have coffee with her. I'm saying sort of how would it be received if somebody was trying to write mainstream children's literature, say, and they are a Zionist, and they are not a Zionist who qualifies with a million things about why they're actually a left-wing Zionist?
I think you raise a great point, and not so much separating the art from the artist. So what is this Zionist art? So a Zionist writes a poem. What is it in that poem that would not be permissible? If you're saying we will not publish this poem, which is completely divorced from anything Zionist, because the poet is a Zionist, that is utterly objectionable.
Well, most Jews are some sort of Zionist, right? Like, so of one form or another. So that would basically mean that like 3 Jews, who admittedly are probably overrepresented in the field of poetry writing, but yes.
Well, so it's content versus creator, and so if you're saying the creator is banned, that is very frightening to me, versus the content. That's a whole other conversation you can have, worthy, not worthy.
Well, I am talking a little bit also about the content, because I think there is something where mainstream children's literature has taken on a very like specific political sort of like I'm thinking about all the young adult literature where authors are, under fire for any sort of violation of political correctness. And this has been going on for years. This is certainly not a post-October 7th thing. You can only be in the literary world if you have certain progressive positions, which include specific positions about Israel, but also about a whole host of other issues. So I guess what I find frustrating is I'm somebody who would like to see all the information out there, all the people reading everything, but it seems like it's not that there's, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't get the sense that there's one side that's for stifling free expression and another side that's wanting it to flourish. It seems like there's a lot of just everybody wants the free expression of their own views, if that makes sense. And then it's hard. It's heartening to hear what you gave a speech about and all of this, because I feel like a lot of the time it is just this kind of like free expression is selectively embraced as the people who, I
totally agree. Yeah. And so you're right, it gets muddy. And I think there is a certainly amongst progressives to only tar those on the right as being intolerant, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you raise a very good point. Yeah, you see it on, and I guess I would argue extremes on either end, on any end, is not healthy or productive and is ultimately doomed to just being, not just static, destructive.
So do Jews have a special place for in like in embracing free speech? Is it Jewish values? Avi, I'm going to ask you as well for this one. Is it Jewish values to support free speech, or is it things unrelated?
Anytime a question like this shows up, I always point to and this has come up on the show in the past, and I think I've mentioned this in the past also, that the Talmud already goes to great lengths to preserve wrong opinions, right? About even minor, inconsequential things, but just as much for major ones, to go and say, this person is wrong, and yet we preserved it's invariably his opinion in the Talmud, his opinion, because one can learn from it. I keep thinking about, I would love to go to a store in the deepest South in Alabama and go to a bookstore where they carry Ibram Kendi's book. And the person behind the counter tells me, I think this book is wrong. I think this person doesn't have right ideas, right? But I want you to read this book and make the decision for yourself, right? It's not up to the influencer to go and say, right, this idea is so bad. And I don't think that there's ever a case. And the cases where we have in the Jewish community, historically, of these things happening, they've always ended very poorly, right? When the Maimonides' books were banned and they were burned, and it ended very poorly. It did not go well within the Jewish community. It did not go well outside the Jewish community, and ultimately we don't do this. And there are recent examples of censorship that happens, especially in the Haredi community. There was a famous book called The Making of a Gadol, which was this guy's biography of a very famous rabbi, which had some things in the footnotes that were less than hagiographic. And yet this book caused such an uproar, it ended up being banned. Copies now are rare to find, or they're easier to find now because, it's been 25 years on and you can find it in most major research libraries. But it was such minor things, but it really backfired because, as you said, nothing does more to a book than banning it because everybody wants to find out what's going on. Ideas always want to be free. Cory Doctorow that said information wants to be free. And just anytime you try to stifle any of that information, Judaism understands that and says, no, go ahead, learn it, understand that it's wrong, right? But figure it out for yourself. I don't need, to be the one to go and say, this is so bad that you shouldn't even read it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good. Yeah, I think the living of the values is important too, and the not drawing the long skirt on somebody is maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I think, but again, my concern is the context. So when we talk about Mein Kampf, and there's an annotated version with, I think it's 3,500 references, if you will, that's a very different reading experience than just plucking Mein Kampf off a shelf. So I think you're right. We do a disservice to the original narrative if we convert it and transform it to reflect modern day sensibilities. I think what we should do, or our responsibility, is to take the original text and offer the right context. And so you can do Huckleberry Finn.
Have a 2-volume slipcased edition,
which is wonderful. So then a teacher that I know everyone in the room today would embrace, who teaches Huckleberry Finn, and there are passages with the N-word, and we know it's toxic. Then you say this was acceptable at that time. And you can argue how times have changed. And what was once a given is no longer a given. There's value in that. The only concern, as I say, is somebody who takes books without context could, of course, either not necessarily be offended, could be led down the wrong path. In that sense, books, we all know books thank goodness, books can make a difference.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Books absolutely can and do and should make a difference. Please come back on anytime. And thank you for having all this great talk about stuff. We'd love to hear what you thought. Please email us with comments and any questions you might have at bonjour@thecjn.ca. Coming up after this, our nachas, for which Emil has chosen to stick around and tell us about a nachas.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
Emil, thank you for sticking around. What's your nachas this week?
My nachas actually came from my visit to Montreal this week as part of the writer in residence at the Jewish Public Library. Across the street from the library is the Siegel Center. And again, from anyone who's in Montreal, I'm old enough to remember it was called the Sadie Bronfman Center at one point.
Of course.
And what they have is twice. It's actually coming up on February 29th and March 3rd at the Siegel Center, a Yiddish version of Death of a Salesman.
Whoa.
And it's called Toit von un Salesman. I love how they spelled the Yiddish spelling of salesman is Seylsman. So Seyle, salesman. You can almost picture, you can hear the Yiddish accent behind it. But I mention it also because it was my father's. I was very fortunate to be raised, and again, not unlike many Jews, I would say, in a household where culture, where literature, where the arts were deeply, deeply valued. And my father had a little bookshelf in our apartment on Plamondon in Montreal, and he would label as you would at your own library. And he saw the original production of Death of a Salesman on Broadway. And I know it affected him profoundly. And so here I thought this is almost a melding of all my particular interest, my history, family, larger than family in terms of this play, of course, which is a seminal work. And so I just loved the idea. And even again, Camp Dora, it's being presented by the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater. And I went to Jewish summer camps growing up in Montreal, and Dora Wasserman came up, and we had the Yiddish songs, etc. And just Yiddish as a language is such a beautiful, rich language. And I don't have many regrets in life, but typically when I was 9 or 10, my parents sent me, I think it was called the Rudchevsky School on Van Horn near Côte de Neige, to learn Yiddish. And, being 9 or 10, I couldn't wait to leave. And how I so regret that missed opportunity, because it's such a beautiful language. It was my father's Mama Loshin, and I would have loved, and there will be surtitles, by the way, but that brought me nachas. Great joy.
Yiddish is available on Duolingo, so it's never too late.
Yeah, you're right. There you go. I'm still struggling with making my French passable now that I'm visiting Montreal on a regular basis.
Awesome. Phoebe, what's your nachas or broigas this week?
I'm doing a dual nachas broigas, okay? Oof. So the nachas,
the 1-2 punch.
Yes, it's the same thing is going to be nachas and broigas. So the nachas is David Tanis's. It's available to New York Times recipe subscribers. So it's a pretty simple recipe for homemade pita bread. So the nachas it's nice to make pita bread at home. The broigas is this recipe, and more broadly what it says about recipes. So there's a line in it, okay? For the best flavor, try to get freshly milled whole wheat flour. Even though only little is called for in the recipe, it makes a difference. Now, there's only so much you could do. And it is this, I am biased by the fact that I have little children. I'm biased by the fact that I live in Canada. Unlike, I think David Tanis may live in Berkeley, California, where, food may be a little bit nicer. I have a thing about recipes that ask for the impossible, because I feel like that discourages home cooking, and it just makes me despair about my own abilities to get these special ingredients that need to be procured throughout a very leisurely day. If you're working full time and have little kids, you're probably not doing this. I'm not saying all recipes need to be geared towards that, but something about the freshly milled, I'm taking the flour out of the tub in the drawer, and I'm like, well, I'm sure it's fine. And I'm just thinking, is anybody really going to taste?
I know more than one person who's broken out into a cold sweat trying to follow an Otto Lengi recipe. That you have to go across town to get that one little Chinese, spice. They've just said it's great.
So first of all, oh my God, I have so much to say. So first of all, I love David Tanis. His recipes are generally so simple. You're 100% right, and so straightforward generally, and they're so flavorful. If you just
ignore the
little bits. I find that with Ottolenghi, the little things that he does to pack flavor in are sometimes so worth it, and then you have a new piece in your arsenal. My pet peeve with recipes that go wrong is the caramelizing the onions, where they make you assume that it takes 10 minutes. And it always takes an hour. And why do they ever tell you that it takes 10 minutes? And I think it's because they're afraid that you're never going to make the recipe if you do that. But that's always been my problem. My nachas this week, very simple, very straightforward. There was an article that has been sitting in an open tab for 3 weeks, and I never got to it, and I should have, because it's a short article, and it wasn't so in-depth and so amazing, but it was so important because it's entitled, it's from JTA, and it was called John Zorn's Avant-Garde Jewish Music is finally on Spotify. His fans remain locked in debate. And I couldn't possibly think of a more Jewish way to discuss a very, very Jewish, very fascinating artist named John Zorn, who has his own record label, who for years was holding out on all of the digital streams. And when everybody would come into my house and see all of the CDs that I had, I would be like, well, yes, I pay for a streaming service, but look at how much music isn't on streaming services. And I would point as one example right away to John Zorn's label Tzaddik, of which I had hundreds of records, hundreds of albums. And I'd be like, you see, I can't get any of this on Spotify, and now I can. So I don't know what to say about that, but I will still collect them. The artwork, the physical product is still beautiful. The elaborate packaging on some of them is still, second to none. But the debate behind whether, it should be or it shouldn't be, and having that Jewish debate was great. And just the music of John Zorn in general is so fabulous. And it's a little thorny to get into, but go for it. Great episode as always, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It was just really, really great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending February 24th, Shabbat Parashat Tetzaveh. The show is produced and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.